Hi, friends. Welcome to another edition of the Lovecast. You are listening to episode 115, which is entitled Why I Chose Not to Participate in Blackout Tuesday. Again, let me repeat. You're listening to episode 115, which is entitled Why I Chose Not to Participate in Blackout Tuesday. Okay, guys, I hope you are all doing well. It's been quite a tumultuous week in the United States and even around the world, but predominantly here in the United States. We've had a week of protests in relation to again the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and so that has purportedly ignited a bunch of protests nationwide. And so I really feel compelled to speak very directly about this matter. I'm gonna, just a disclaimer here. There's some things I'm gonna share here that I really do feel compelled. I haven't said much, publicly, on social media or different places about these events, because I wanted to sit and really ponder with some of the things I was observing. So what I did, and again, the title in the title of this podcast, I chose not to participate in Blackout Tuesday. So if you're listening to this and you're not aware of what Blackout Tuesday was, okay, this past week on Tuesday, there was a social media kind of campaign in order to stand in solidarity with the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. There was this campaign for everybody on social media to post like black squares or like a black space on social media. And again, the idea behind this is a show of force or a sense of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and what the message is and what's trying to be communicated. And so the idea was, if everyone joins in, posts these black squares, it's like a way of saying, hey, we're going to mute our posts so we give space for the Black Lives Matter movement and these protests to be heard. And a lot of folks participated in that. So I did not participate in that. I chose very consciously. I did not feel good about it. I chose not to participate in it because there was something that wasn't sitting well with me, and I needed to really sit with that and listen and observe why this entire campaign was not sitting well with me. It still does not sit well with me. A lot of what I'm seeing doesn't sit well with me for specific reasons. But I needed to sit with it and observe. So I really spent some time observing, and obviously this is a posture that I'm that I'm actually living out in my normal day-to-day life, as far as just being in a meditative, contemplative, observant place. But I really, really listened very closely this week as to why this did not sit well with me, okay? And I made some observations. And these observations, I want to communicate them to you. Now, I want to just a disclaimer here, okay? Number one, lots of folks participated in Blackout Tuesday, posted the black squares. There is absolutely zero judgment on my end for the folks who participated, because pretty much everybody participated in that in the country, because people have good hearts and they mean well, and and people want to support African American brothers and sisters, and I do too as well. So obviously I understand the goodness of the hearts of folks who participated in that. There is no, if you participated in Blackout Tuesday and you've been posting about what's going on in the world, there's zero judgment from me to you. Okay, I totally acknowledge your goodness in that. So I don't want you to hear what I'm about to say in this podcast as judgment about you or what you've done, or this is right or wrong. That is not the spirit in which I'm communicating, okay? What I do want to communicate to you, however, will be a bit controversial for some folks, okay? This is not a podcast for everybody. So some people may not like what I'm about to say and what I'm going to share, because it may come across to some people as offensive, insensitive, tone deaf, all of these labels that could be used to characterize my positions here, okay? Tone deaf, insensitive, all of these things. So you kind of, because I didn't participate and I don't plan on participating, okay? And whatever else happens. Now but I do feel compelled, okay, to share with you. If you are triggered by this podcast, by this conversation, what I'm going to share, I just want you to know, especially if I know you, it does not change how I feel about you. I love you, appreciate you. But if you feel triggered or bothered by this, or you think you may, just turn it off. You can turn the podcast off. I do not want you to listen to something that disturbs you or causes you to feel uncomfortable or to be angry. That's not my heart in creating this podcast. So I would just encourage you to turn it off and just to say, okay, I just don't agree with Jamal. I don't see where he's coming from. I don't feel it. That's totally fine. It's totally fine. Like, my agenda in sharing this podcast with you is not to convince you of anything, not to, make you believe something, none of that. Okay. My goal with this podcast is to share with you my observations. Number one, because I do believe my observations are valid and important to be shared. And I feel compelled. I really feel compelled to share these things with you. So I'm going to share them with you, okay? And if it resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, that's totally fine as well. But I do feel compelled that I can't sit on these observations. I really feel compelled to share them with you. So I'm creating this podcast as an explanation of why I did not participate in Blackout Tuesday and what I am observing, because I have observed very specific things that have confirmed to me why I don't feel good about what's happening, not in a sense of fear or panic, but to be aware and for observations purposes. Okay, so that's your disclaimer. That's your warning. You may hear some things that you don't like. You may hear some things that seem tone deaf, insensitive. I get that, and that is your right to feel that way. And again, this podcast probably is not for you. But if you do want to hear what I have to say and consider, I would invite you to consider, first of all, my heart, the spirit in which I'm communicating this, but also that you would take to heart some things I'm going to share and ponder them for yourself. Okay? That's all I'm asking. So if you feel like you can stomach this conversation, if you just get that sense, keep listening and bear with me to the end. Okay? Listen to the whole conversation. Don't shut it off in midway if you if you agree or if you feel like this is something that's important. Just keep listening to it the whole way, okay? Unless you're triggered, then turn it off. But if you're not triggered, please listen to the whole conversation. Okay, I know that's a long way to introduce all of this, but I feel very strongly about these points I'm going to make. So I want to set it up correctly and with proper intention, okay? So I have observed some things, okay? And I'm going to share with you in this podcast 3 major things that I've observed this week that I believe are going on in our wider society that you need to be aware of. 3 distinct things that are vitally important that you keep in mind, okay? But before I do that, I want to make a statement. It's kind of a premise, so to speak, that I want to challenge some conventional thinking on what you're seeing going on, okay? If you turn on the news, if you've been on social media, it is very apparent that we are in the midst of another crisis, okay? And that is a crisis where there's protests. Obviously on the surface it seems like it's about the tragic death of George Floyd and at the hands of those police officers in Minneapolis, and there's all these protests and there's a lot of racial tension in our country. Okay, that's obvious, but I actually do not believe that's true. I do not believe that's a true narrative. I actually don't think the protests are about George Floyd and his death, and I don't think the protests are rooted very specifically in this particular incident, okay? I do understand that there's a racial issue that's being brought up, but I do not believe the protests you are seeing is a result of the death of George Floyd. That is the illusion. Now, I know that's a tall tale. You may be listening to this going, well, that you're going to have to explain this one to me. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to try to make that case. Okay? But in order for me to do that, I need to share with you the 3 observations that I have observed this week. Okay? First observation I want to share with you that I've observed, and I've observed this much longer than just this week, but specifically this week in regards to all the protests. Here's an observation I have made, okay? That the idea of a free press in this country is a myth. It's a myth. So I've observed the myth of a free press, okay? Now let me unpack that a little bit, what I mean by that, a free press. It's a myth. Okay, in a free society, in a democracy or a free society where there's open and there's freedom, the press is essential and secure, and actually it plays an essential role in that free society, because the press are able to, pretty much what journalists do is they ask questions. Okay, and the idea of a free press in a free country is that they are, number one, are allowed to ask questions. Number two, that they report on what is happening. So when you, quote unquote, watch the news, you get an idea of what is happening, fairly accurate. Obviously, everybody's coming at something and, telling a story with a certain slant, a certain angle. That's kind of human nature. Really difficult to avoid that completely. But the idea of a free press is that you have some sense of objectivity where somebody's just telling you the story of what's happening in the world. It's not, they're not trying to shape a narrative, shape a story. They're just telling you what's happening. That is what happens when you have a free press. Okay. And the idea of that has been held up in our country as being important. Okay. But I would like to tell you, and for a lot of you who are listening to this podcast, this is probably not news to you, but there is no free press in this country. We have lost that. I could make the case that we lost it a long time ago. However, I do not believe in the freedom. I don't believe that there is a free press in this country. Okay. So in a more totalitarian country, you typically will have state-run media. So like if you go to China or North Korea, for that matter, Russia, some of these other countries in the Middle East, they don't even pretend there's a free press. They just tell you that the media is state-run. So you have to be sanctioned by the government. Then what you hear in the news is what the government is telling you. Okay? And so a non-free press does not report what's happening. A non-free press creates a narrative and tells you that narrative and then demands that you agree with that narrative. And if you don't, then there's consequences for that. They do not allow for other narratives to be told. That's what happens when you don't have a free press and you have a state-run media. So people have said, well, in America, we don't have a state-run media. Well, you kind of do, but it's obviously under the guise of the free market system. But in our country, and again, I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me here, okay? Bear with me here. It's very evident to me that in this country, the press does not report what's happening. It shapes the narrative and then communicates a specific narrative of what's happening. I have fairly good evidence and proof for this, which I'm going to unpack. Okay, you need to hear me what I'm saying here. Okay, you got to listen to some of these things, but I'm going somewhere here. So in a non-free press, which is what I believe we have in this country, we have a state-run media, so to speak. There's a creation of a narrative, and then the people follow that narrative if they're not aware of that. They are kind of just like in North Korea. They actually believe that what they hear in the news is actually what goes on in the world, and it's really interesting. And there's so many studies done into that. It's amazing how people, because they don't know that they're just being told a perspective that's actually a very specific angle. It's a narrative. It has very little to do with what's going on. in reality. So they're being told certain things. So if you don't know that, then you just kind of follow what you're hearing and you react to what you're hearing. Okay. So in the United States, even though we don't have a state-run media like specifically owned by the U.S. government, we do have control of the media, and that control is by so we have CNN. We're in a 24-hour news cycle. That's been around for several years, 20 years or so. So we've been in a 24-hour news cycle. So the news media is pretty much CNN. The mainstream media is CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and then of course you have the major networks: NBC, ABC, CBS News. Okay, all of those news divisions, or what we call the mainstream media, they're predominantly owned by 6 corporations. Okay, now that's not good or bad. It's just you have a small group of people a small group of corporations that own all the media outlets. Okay, and those media outlets shape the narrative. Okay, so social media. Now let's bring in the social media because that's fairly within the last 10 years become a force in our society, in the media source. I mean, that's why we have politicians that use Twitter and Facebook to get their messages out. They're kind of bypassing the traditional media sources. So we also have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as the major kind of social networking drivers that communicate information. Okay. If you look at your social media feed, if you're on Facebook, I would just encourage you to pay attention to the feed. The feed is a mirror of the corporate media. So when the corporate media is talking about coronavirus, guess what you see on your feeds? Your Facebook feeds, your Instagram feeds. Coronavirus, right? And when the corporate media is now talking about, racism and the death of George Floyd and the riots that are going on, guess what you're seeing in social media? That's right. Same thing. So the media, social media, doesn't reflect what's actually happening in day-to-day lives, by and large. When we have these tumultuous times that we're having now, social media is a direct reflection of the mainstream news media. And the mainstream news media is a tool, and again, you might say a tool of who? Tool of somebody, and I'm going to make the case for this. It is a tool to tell you that actually creates a narrative, that shapes a narrative, and then social media reinforces that narrative, and then everyone talks about that, okay? So I have friends on social media. I'm pretty active on social media normally. It's how I, communicate and share ideas and all those kinds of things, just like anybody else. And I have noticed that a lot of my friends, quote unquote friends that are on social media, they're talking about racism. They're talking about the riots. They're talking about white and black issues with the white folks and black folks, and all this conversations about that. Why? Because that is what's the narrative on the mainstream media. So, to me, this idea that there is a free press in our country that is just reporting on what's happening is not accurate. My contention is that the media is shaped, okay, the corporate media is actually shaping the story, and then social media parrots that story and just kind of takes it further from there. And that shows you, and social media is really simply people's feeds, is what people are talking about. That shows me that people are taking their cues from the corporate media. So people talk about what the media creates the narrative, and people talk about what the media says to talk about. So we only talk about on social media what the media is talking about. And the media is sharing some things on purpose for a reason, which I have not made that case yet, but bear with me, okay? But that's the first thing I've observed. The press is in control of the narrative. The press in this country is in control of the narrative. They are sharing it. Social media is parroting it. And by social media, I'm talking about people like you and I. Folks on social media are little parrots of what the mainstream media is talking about. And that's why our social media feeds are filled with all of these reactions, okay? Now, the media purports that they're just reporting what's happening. The idea is that, no, we're journalists, we're asking questions, we're reporting. But that's not actually the case, which I'm going to share that here here in a few minutes. But number one thing that I've observed, just from observation standpoints, is that there is no free press in this country. It's a myth. There is actually a press that shapes the narrative. It doesn't report the narrative. It shapes it. Okay, so my second observation, which I think will feed off the first observation, and again, I'm going to make a case for why I believe that the media is not free and that it's shaping the narrative. The second thing I've observed, my observation, is that there is a use of terror by the press, by the media, the press, to establish a narrative. Okay? I've observed that. There's a use of terror by the press to establish a narrative. Anytime an entity, an individual, a group uses terror to shape a narrative, that is evidence, number one, that you no longer have a free society to think, ask questions, make observations. Because whenever terror becomes a tool to create a narrative, you lose the ability to ask questions and have objectivity and have conversation. Okay? Because terror is used to set up a narrative. Okay? So let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, 9/11, all right? The folks who perpetrated 9/11, you all, if you were alive in September 11th, 2001, you know what happened, okay? There were planes that flew into buildings, buildings fell. There was terror. It was an act of terror, is what it's called. And that terror was traumatic. The whole nation, it's made a mark on folks all over the world, but specifically our country was terrorized, okay? Now, the people who did it, the idea behind that is that they used terror to try to accomplish a political aim or political agenda, okay? They used terror to accomplish a political agenda. And whenever this is done, this is the classic idea of terrorism, is that I'm going to use terror, the threat of violence or actual violence, to accomplish an aim, even if the aim may be noble or good. So it depends on who the group is that's accomplishing this. So, we're told that it's folks from the Middle East that knocked the buildings down and caused the events of 9/11. So that is a narrative. And so why would they do that? And of course, the narrative there was that, they wanted certain political objectives, Americans to get out of the Middle East, change their policy towards Israel, all these different things. And so therefore they used terror to try to change American government policy or affect American policy in the world and that kind of thing. That is a agenda. There's other folks who, there were a number of government folks in our House of Representatives and the Senate that questioned the narrative of like the Patriot Act. So 3 days after 9/11, there was a 1,200-page document that was introduced to Congress, which, pretty radically altered our way of life, because most of the, constitutional, rights and freedoms that are protected or guaranteed by the Constitution were suspended in this thing called the Patriot Act. And that was, of course, introduced. It was a 1,200-page bill that was introduced just 3 days after 9/11. So there were folks raising questions going, wait, who wrote a 1,200-page bill in 3 days? And the answer was pretty clear. Like, no, it wasn't written in 3 days. It was written well before 9/11. But there was, because of the terror in the country, now this bill would have been controversial at any other time. That bill would not get passed through Congress or signed into law by any president, because it was sweeping reforms to, freedoms, the everyday freedoms that we enjoy. That would have been a very controversial bill if it didn't happen outside of a period of terror. But because of 9/11 and the country was afraid and terrorized by what they saw in the media, nobody questioned it. And even congressmen, I think there was over 430, I can't remember how many House of Representative members there are, but it's over 400. And in 3 days after 9/11, when they introduced the Patriot Act to be voted on legislation, or within a week or whatever it was, only one congressman out of over 400 had read all 1,200 pages. most of the Congress, House of Representatives and the Senate just voted and passed this legislation because the idea was like, if you can't question it because that would be unpatriotic. So the government needs this authority to fight the war on terror. That was the idea. Again, because of terror, I'm going somewhere with this, because of terror, people didn't really question that. Okay. So whenever a group uses terror to accomplish an aim, you are no longer free. Okay. So it's like a bully at school that just says, hey, you give me your lunch money, and if not, I'm gonna beat you up. Give me your, So again, that's a very simplistic idea, but you don't really have a chance to decide. Hey, what is this guy saying? He wants my money. Okay, is that legitimate? What are my options? What's the best option? Like, you can't really think about that because your safety is being threatened. So you just got to, whatever they say, just do it because your safety's on the line. Okay, that's a very simplistic way. But that's how terror works. There's no voluntary thought in it. There's no questioning. It's just do it or else. Okay. So the media, and again, that's literally what terrorism is. Okay. So whether it's Al Qaeda or, some extremist group or whatever that's wanting to accomplish its aims, it feels powerless. So it says, hey, let me just use terror in some ways to get people to do what I want them to do. Okay. What I have observed this week is that terror is the chief methodology, and not just this week. Let me back up. What I've observed by the media, and especially this week, but this has been going on for a while, that the media is using the tool of terror to set up a narrative. Okay, I know. Bear with me. That's a stretch. I know. Hear me out. Okay. Let's go back to the coronavirus. Can we do that for a moment? Okay, let's go back to the coronavirus because these narratives have been deeply affecting many people. I'm a life coach. I'm navigating these events with people on a day in and day out basis. I see how it affects, first of all, I see how it affects me, but I also see how it affects people. Okay, so we need to know how to navigate this. Okay, so when the coronavirus thing first came out, it was panic. It was terror. Why were people so terrorized? I mean, why were people making runs on the stores, right? Why were people doing these things? And you couldn't find toilet paper, and there were, all kinds of problems and fear and panic and all this. And why? Why was that happening? Okay. Because by and large, what you were hearing in the media was pretty alarming. I mean, we're talking about the pandemic and widespread, people are going to die and we're going to have millions of bodies lined up. And there were all kinds of predictions, the models that were coming out, the medical models, that we were going to have, and people thought this, there were a lot of people who thought this, and that's what you heard, on the news. If you watch the mainstream media, I mean, what were you hearing? You were hearing, guys like Dr. Fauci or the government, doctor that was being put out in front of the cameras, by the government, and also on talk shows. And, they were talking about how dire the situation is and how we're in for, this is very dangerous. This is unprecedented. And we could see people die all over just doomsday apocalyptic scenarios. Okay. That's what we heard. That's all we heard. So that was why, that was terror. So what did people do? I mean, when government folks, when, governors and, our local authorities were saying, shut the whole economy down, everybody stay home, nobody leaves your house. These are unprecedented actions that were taken in our country. Okay. This has never happened before, ever in the history of modern civilization. You have never had a time where mass populations were, quote, I hate to use this word, but really kind of put on house arrest, were confined to their homes. You've never heard of this. You've never seen this kind of behavior ever. Now, don't get me wrong. I've said this before, that there have been some really good things that have come out of this pause and are coming out of this pause. I really believe that. So I'm not trying to be all negative here. What I am saying, however, is that you have never seen a reaction the way we have The world reacted. Lock everybody in their homes. Nobody can leave. If you leave, you wear a mask. Social distancing, 6 feet apart, no mass gatherings, all of these things. This was a reaction, okay, that wasn't based on any past precedent. It just wasn't. The past precedent was if somebody's sick, you quarantine the sick. You don't quarantine healthy people. You don't quarantine the whole world. You can't quarantine the whole world. I mean, that's literally has never been done. So it would take nobody really questioned that narrative by and large. I mean, there were a few people here and there questioning it, like, what, this is crazy. But really nobody questioned it by and large, because what were we told? You're going to die. We could have this could be the next Black Plague of Europe, that we read about in the history books. And, this is what people were thinking. So therefore, and all the models were predicting it, and this is bad. I mean, do you remember your social media feeds? This just a few weeks ago, people on my feeds were talking about, you gotta stay home. We're going to have, there was true panic. Like we're going to have X. I mean, it was unprecedented. And I felt really bad for people, that were just traumatized and afraid and panicking. And I get it. There's no judgment in that. I understand that. But that's why nobody questioned, shut down the entire global economy. Again, I'm not saying it's bad or good. There are going to be serious ramifications because of it, for sure. But nobody questioned it, okay? Because the narrative was, we're all going to die. That was the tool the media used, okay? Also, the same situation is occurring in regards. Let me switch gears here to this protest, okay? The same situation is occurring in regards to the protest. Okay, terror. Now, I don't know about you, and I work with folks every day. I am very sensitive to trauma. I understand what it does to a person, what it can do to a person, how it affects us. It's real. And when you experience trauma, it doesn't just go away. It affects you deeply. It affects your health, your immune system. It affects your future, your ability to think of solutions, creative solutions. It shuts all that completely down, and it really paralyzes you. And it's devastating, especially when it happens to children. But terror in any form, when people are terrorized and traumatized, it's devastating. Okay, I don't know about you, but that video of George Floyd being murdered by that police officer was traumatizing. That video of George Floyd being murdered by that police officer was extremely traumatic. And I believe that most of the country was traumatized by watching that video. I mean, deep trauma. That's why people took to the streets and protested this, because the trauma, just the sheer trauma of what that does to see an innocent human being be mercilessly put to death in a cold-blooded fashion like that. That is absolute deep trauma. It's kind of like 9/11 when people just saw the trauma of just these commercial airplanes being flown into buildings and human beings dying in front of our face on primetime television. I mean, the trauma that elicits on this entire society, entire world, is devastating. And it's the same thing with this video of George Floyd's killing. Okay, I mean, this is why there were so many violent protests. Obviously, because when you're traumatized, what happens in your brain? Just whenever somebody experiences trauma, your sympathetic nervous system at the base of your brain kicks in. It's a very primitive operating system, basically, that we're all, evolution designed us to have so that we could, under extreme duress, defend ourselves or to get out of danger. So it's a fight or flight response, but it is a response from trauma. So when that is kicked in, either on an individual basis or collective basis, you either fight or you hide and run. Okay, so it was the flight. Let's all run and hide in our houses. That's the flight response elicited by the mass media, which was traumatizing us with these messages of we're all going to die. This is unprecedented. It's really horrible. So we run and hide, lock ourselves away, when you operate in the fight or flight response, it degrades your immune system. It does all of the resources that you need to build your immune system and to, have proper health are rediverted to the fight or flight response so that you can stay alive. Okay. You're not actually designed to live in that for too long of a time. It's only for brief periods when you are under extreme duress. Okay. So if you stay in that fight or flight response for too long, you compromise your immune system, you become paralyzed, you have health issues, all these different kinds of things happen when you stay in fight or flight. It leads to further trauma. So coronavirus, we ran and hide, okay, because of trauma, terror that was used. But now with the video that we're being shown by the media of George Floyd's death, the other part of that, the other half of that sympathetic response is fight. And I'll be honest, I have a lot of, I'm in connection with a lot of people who claim to be pacifist and nonviolent Christians who, do not espouse to violence, but even they were questioning, maybe it's time to fight. Maybe it's time to get violent to accomplish, or at least be sympathetic to the people who are using violence, terror, to accomplish their aims. So terrorized people terrorize people. So people are terrorized by the initial video that was shown to us by the media. And now they now use terror to accomplish their aim. No peace, no justice, no peace. Basically, that's a threat. No justice, no peace. You don't give me justice, then I will not give you peace. It's a threat of violence. You terrorize me, I terrorize you. Okay, it's terror. It's terror. The use of terror. People are terrorized. That's why they resorted to violence. Okay, so here's the point I'm trying to make here. Okay, the media. I believe this was not a benevolent move by the media. Now, I know it's a stretch, but bear with me. Again, like I said, keep bearing with me. I'm not done yet. I believe the media the use of that video of the murder of George Floyd in the way that it was used by the media was very intentional and purposeful to create terror so that it would ignite a rage response. We had the flight response with coronavirus where everybody's afraid and hiding. And now we have the fight response where everybody now wants to fight and protest and rage. Okay. This was intentional. Now, and the reason I believe that, okay, is because of history. I think it was Will Smith who recently said, racism is not new. It's just now being recorded, however. That's why you're seeing it in the way it is. It's not new. This has been going on for a while, is his point. It's being recorded now, and you're seeing more recordings of it. I actually disagree with that. Racism is not new. It's a systemic problem. We've had it in this country for a long time, overtly and also covertly in regards to like systemic racism, the way the police are trained and to respond to the public. And there's some systemic racism there. I believe that's a whole other conversation. However, it's been recorded for a long time. This is not just something new that's getting recorded. You only hear about things the media wants you to hear about. There are a lot of things that don't make the media. You know that, right? There are many things that don't make the media. And you never hear about it. They're recorded too. They're recorded crimes against lots of people, including black people. There are racial crimes against black people. Been going on for a long time. The media doesn't tell you about it by and large because that doesn't fit the agenda. Again, in a country where there's no free press, the media shapes the narrative. They don't report the narrative, they shape it. So the fact that you're seeing George Floyd's video of his death all over the place is because they want you to see it. Because there's other things they don't want you to see, and I'm going to tell you about a few of those. Okay. Again, this is a part of the narrative. Okay. Create terror to create a response. That's what I've observed, the use of terror by the press. The third thing that I've witnessed, okay, this is my third observation, my last observation that I witnessed as a result of what's going on, is the solidification of what I would call groupthink. The solidification of groupthink. Okay, so by the press. So the press creates a narrative which then creates groupthink. And then anybody who deviates from the groupthink is then singled out for either ridicule, ostracization, to be called names, or, whatever it is. So when there's groupthink going on, you can't ask just very simple, what I would call, legitimate questions about anything. You can't question anything, because now once you go outside the groupthink, you become a danger, a threat. Okay. Now I'm going to give you an example of this. Okay. Did you know, this is just to make an example here, the CDC, the same group who was quoted early on in the coronavirus pandemic when it first broke out, the CDC and the World Health Organization, both were cited to their predictions, their models were cited as part of the basis as to why we should be afraid, stay in our home, have these massive lockdowns and shut down the economy, and wear masks and don't go out. And if you do go out, stay 6 feet apart and all those things. Most of that recommendation was from the predictions of the CDC and other folks at the World Health Organization. And did you know that just, a couple weeks ago, right before all of the protests started, I'm talking the day of or the day before, or just right around that time, the CDC was kind of forced to reintroduce new numbers based on the data. Okay. And the data that the CDC released basically shows that the coronavirus is very similar. Yes, I said it. It was crazy, right? Very similar to other viruses like influenza A and B and the flu viruses. Very similar. And actually the mortality rate is not that different. There's not that many more deaths. And I know that sounds crazy, because that's not, people are going, well, where did you get this information? Where did you hear this? Right. Why do you think you're asking me that question? I've actually, in some of the conversations I've had, I said, well, the CDC is now reporting that the mortality rate of the coronavirus is very similar to the flu. Now, that's not to say the flu is not serious. No, the flu is serious. It is deadly to almost 50 to 60,000 people every year in this country. People die of the flu every year. So I'm not saying the flu is not serious. It's not a serious illness. We have a problem in this country, and had it for a long time, where people are dying of viruses they really shouldn't be dying of. But lots of people have been dying of viruses every year. This isn't new, by the way, but it's new for so many people who watch the media, because you wouldn't hear this. You don't normally hear this and about the flu, or even with the question of asked, why are so many Americans dying every year of flu viruses, when in other countries the same flu virus exists and you have very small mortality rate. Places in Asia specifically have this is true every year of influenza A and B. Many people in places like Korea and Hong Kong and China, some of these other places, have very low death rates. But people in the West, America, the UK, places of Europe have higher death rates. Why is that? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So the same narrative with the coronavirus. Higher mortality rates in America and in some parts of Europe, lower mortality rates in some parts of Asia. Now we're told it has to do with our response, right? Quarantining and all this kind of thing. But this is not any different any other year from the flu. And the CDC literally released new data that says, yeah, it's not that different. It's a little bit elevated as far as the mortality rate, slightly elevated from influenza A and B. But even the numbers they have are acknowledge that they don't have accurate reporting. Okay. It's much less lethal than they thought. Now, you didn't hear that. Did you hear that on the news? No, but it's true. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's actually true, but you did not hear that. This is my point. Why didn't you hear it? Why wasn't that the headlines? Coronavirus is vastly much less lethal than we first thought, comparable to the flu. Because you can't justify the response of locking down the entire free world. You can't justify that with those data points, right? Now this is coming straight from the CDC. If you haven't heard about it, you need to ask why. Again, because the media didn't want you to know about it, because they didn't report that. Did you know that almost up to 96% of people who test positive for the coronavirus have zero symptoms, asymptomatic. Yeah, asymptomatic. That means if you have a virus that's detected in your body and you don't even get sick from it, how lethal do you think it is? Up to 96% of people who test positive for the coronavirus are asymptomatic. If you can test for a number of viruses in a human being on any given day, and you will detect a number of viruses that are already there. We are a walking petri dish of viruses and bacteria. Testing positive for coronavirus means nothing. You can make that case. It actually means nothing. Some people will have adverse effects. Obviously, we know that people who have compromised immune systems are going to suffer from the coronavirus, just like they suffer from other viruses, and it can be fatal. We know this. This is nothing new. But you haven't heard you haven't really heard this by and large from CNN, ABC News, MSNBC, Fox, whatever. You really don't hear that narrative. And if you do, it's in the narrative of conspiracy theorists. Okay. Now, did you know that doctors, virologists, people, I'm talking MD doctors, people practicing in the field of medicine, have actually have written articles, produced YouTube videos to report the same thing, that the numbers of the coronavirus are very comparable to the flu and are not that lethal, and they were banned on YouTube. Social media platforms took down that information. These folks were ridiculed in the mainstream media if some of these things did go viral initially, and then YouTube took the videos down. Google banned it or whatever. They were taken off Facebook because they were. And these are doctors. These aren't like just anybody. These are doctors and virologists. They were saying something vastly different than what the CDC and the World Health Organization and, Dr. Fauci and some of these other folks, National Institutes of Health, were saying. It deviated. They were saying, look, we hear what they're saying, and here's what we're finding is vastly different. And their information was silenced, was not reported on by the mainstream media, and was banned. Now, if they were simply journalists, that would be newsworthy. But again, it went against the narrative. So therefore, because of groupthink, you're not allowed to share these things. And there was again, this is just, you can say it's good or bad, but this is a narrative. So when the media establishes a narrative, if anybody contradicts the narrative, then you're relegated to being outside of groupthink, and therefore you're not to be heard or listened to. But when the CDC released the same numbers, it validated the folks who have been banned on YouTube, banned on social media platforms, and not covered by the mainstream media. The CDC's own data validates those folks, and you didn't hear about it. Here's my point. What you hear about on the media, on the news, is because the media wants you to hear about it. And what you don't hear about is what they don't want you to hear about. That's not a free press. This is what I'm observing. So, here's the question. Why? Why are you hearing about George Floyd's death? Why now? It's a question. It's a legitimate question that I'm asking, and I think you should ask as well. Why are you hearing about George Floyd's death now? Do you know how many people, black men, are killed by police officers on a year-by-year basis that are recorded, that are unjust, excessive force used, dime a dozen, happens all the time. Why are you hearing about this now? It's an important question. It is not. I'm not saying you shouldn't hear about it. I'm not saying that George Floyd's death is not something that we should be really upset about and hurt about and broken about. I'm just asking the deeper question of why is the media telling you about it when they normally don't? Why are they telling you about it now? The media's use of the tool of terror to shape a narrative is inappropriate. It's completely inappropriate. If a narcissist creates a conflict, if you engage in the conflict, you empower the narcissist. Yes, we need to have real, substantive conversations about racism. I do believe that white folks need to listen and understand more, and that's all very real. But this conflict specifically, you cannot. It is to me, racism is too, and racial equality and healing the racial divide in our country is too important of an issue to let the media create the narrative on, because the media will drop this story just as quickly as it started when they're done with it. When it accomplishes the aim, when there's division and destruction in our society, and the economy is decimated, and there's all this, and again, why now? Why are we having this conversation now in the media? Why is it happening now? That's a question you need to ask. I'm not going to pretend to give the answer to you. I'm not going to tell you the answer to that. There's probably a lot of reasons why now, but you should ask it. Why now in 2020 are we having this debate about racism? Okay. You need to ask the question. Again, there are solutions to it, but why is it being brought up now? It's a legitimate question. There's other questions we need to ask. So when you're in reaction mode, you can't ask questions. You're just reacting. It's like that knee-jerk reaction. When you're in fight or flight mode, you cannot be objective and you cannot ask important questions. Okay? You have a right to ask the questions. This is our society. This is your life. You have to ask, why is the media covering things now when they didn't cover them a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago? Did something just change? Did the light switch just come off and now we're suddenly enlightened? No. There's an agenda behind it. And these are questions we need to ask. I have a lot of questions, particularly about what's happening this last couple of weeks in regards to the death of George Floyd and also in regards to the responses to it. To me, and of course, this particular death is very different to me than most police deaths. Most police deaths, when you look at police officers killing unarmed black folks in the past, I mean, the police are highly charged. There's adrenaline running. There's a chase. There's wrestling. There's shouting. There's fear. There's all different kinds of things, and then there's excessive force used, and then that's when somebody loses their life typically. This just an observation on my end. This was very different than that. This was not. George Floyd was very peaceful. He did not resist arrest. The force that was used upon him was extremely excessive. Didn't even follow protocol. So even what the police officer was doing was not normal police behavior. To systematically just basically choke a man to death. The way it was very cold. His demeanor was cold, and he was very calm and calculated. Even though he was being filmed, there was cameras on them. They saw that it was being filmed. It did not faze them. They just systematically, this one particular officer just kept his knee on the man's throat until he was dead. Very methodically. That is odd behavior. That is not normal. That's a break from the norm of what you typically see when police officers end up killing unarmed black men. Okay. I also noticed the way the paramedics treated George Floyd when they arrived on the scene. It was not normal behavior. They basically just threw his body onto a cart. Is there anybody asking that question? Why did the paramedics treat the man in a very uncustomary way? Why did nobody check his pulse? They just threw him on. They didn't even protect his neck or his back. They just threw him on the gurney as if he was just a slab of meat. This is very odd and bizarre behavior, very provocative behavior. I have a question about that. Why? Is anybody looking into that? Does anybody know what the story is behind that? By the way, did you know that police officer who murdered George Floyd, that he worked with George Floyd? They actually knew each other. He worked with him, same company, for over a year. Did you know that? It's an important part of the case. Why aren't we being told that? Does it not fit a narrative? It's good. It's an important question. It's an important question to ask. So my question is, do Black Lives Matter? Of course. And they always have. Why do they matter now to the media? Does health matter? Of course. Always has. So why are we not hearing about, why is the media not telling the American people ways that people can naturally boost their immune system when there is a pandemic? There's a virus that's spreading. There's a lot of unknowns about the virus, right? In light of that, why aren't they telling people what is scientifically known about how to promote and advance your immune system? Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? Because that actually calms people instead of terrorizes people, right? So if the narrative is create terror, they're not going to tell you about how to boost your immune system. They're not going to tell you about things you can do to be healthy. They're just going to tell you to be afraid, stay in your home, don't leave the house, wait for a drug. Because guess what? Being healthy doesn't, if the agenda is sell a drug, sell a pharmaceutical, create a vaccine, take the vaccine. If that's the agenda, then boosting your immune system doesn't fit that narrative, right? Doesn't fit the narrative. These are all questions we need to ask. So I know this is a little bit long, okay? I appreciate you listening to this, hearing my perspective on this. I feel like it's important. I'm not saying these things because I want to rile you up, to scare you, or anything like that. I'm not saying these things even to be, again, we have an ability to ask questions. We have a right to ask questions. We have a responsibility to not react in fear, because we are resilient people. We are powerful people. We are free people. Free people, powerful people do not react in fear. Okay? Now here's a point I want to make, okay? I want you to hear me on this. I don't know if you've ever dealt with a narcissist or somebody with borderline personality disorder or anything like that, okay? I have dealt with that. I know many of you listening to this have probably had family members or people who have, had some form of borderline personality disorder or narcissistic, personality disorder. If you've ever dealt with someone like that, it can be really traumatic. It can be maddening, because somebody with that kind of disorder, what they will do, they tend to be predatory, very predatory people. And what they will do is they will find your weak spots. They will find a button to push to get you to react. And then that's how they have control over you. That's how they control you and manipulate you, is they find an area of weakness and they push that button to get a rise out of you. Now, so here's an example I want to give you, okay? Here's an example. Let's say, for instance, let's say you and another person have a conflict. Let's say somebody in your family hurt you very deeply and you have a conflict with that person, okay? And you have history, and it's really a sensitive subject, okay? And let's say you and this other person are in a home hanging, having, let's say it's a family gathering, and you and this other person are in the same room. What a narcissist would typically do is, if they knew about this and they wanted to create a conflict, the narcissist would get you guys together in a room, and the narcissist would then bring up that issue, would expose that issue, would actually say things to get you to react, and then to get this other person to react, to create a conflict. And then the narcissist would sit back and watch the conflict happen, because that was the aim of the narcissist, was to exploit a real issue, to create a conflict, and then to take pleasure in that, because obviously maybe they had other agendas or another reason for causing that conflict. This is my contention. That is exactly what is going on now. We have had a race problem in this country for a long time. I mean, these things go back over 100 years, more than that. I mean, we've had 400 years of systemic abuse of African American people because of the slavery issue. This has been a huge problem in our country for years. But the reason you are hearing about it now, the reason it's coming to the surface now, at least from the media side of it, is because that is what the media wants. It's like the narcissist in the room that's causing a conflict, that's actually exposing a conflict between two people, pushing the buttons, and then to get the response it's getting. This is my belief. Because here's the thing. Does Black Lives Matter now? Haven't they always mattered? Yeah, they have always mattered. And I'm going to share this with you so that you can be informed, you can be aware, that Black Lives mattered in the late 80s and early 90s. Did you know that? In the late 70s, they mattered. In the 60s, they mattered. But specifically in the early 80s, Black Lives mattered when, there was an attempt by the American government to fund some resistance movements. In South America, there were some communist governments in power, and then there were some resistance movements to those communist governments. That the American government wanted to fund and to provide these groups, these rebel groups in some South American countries, Central America and South American countries. They wanted to supply those rebel armies with weapons and money. And of course, the American government the Congress wasn't participating with the president at the time to fund these, anti-communist rebel groups. And so what they ended up doing, is they found a way to create this substance called crack cocaine. You've heard of crack cocaine, right? They found the drugs in certain Central American countries. They brought it into the United States. They mixed it, created the substance, this highly addictive drug called crack cocaine. They gave it to drug dealers, and then the drug dealers introduced it into the inner cities of our country, and by and large African American communities. And African Americans, this was the introduction of crack cocaine into the inner cities of America, in which an entire generation became hooked on crack cocaine. And then, of course, that generation was then these was penalized legally. There was laws against drugs, and these folks went to prison. So you had an entire generation of children who either had parents who were now addicted to this very addictive drug called crack cocaine, and then because of it was illegal to traffic in those drugs, and a lot of folks went to prison. And so the prisons exploded to the point where we have over a quarter of our population that are now incarcerated, largely because of this war on drugs that was created. The war on drugs was created by the U.S. government, but then the addiction problem itself was largely funded and created by the American government, who created crack cocaine and introduced it into the inner cities. Now, I know if you're still listening to this, you're going, Jamal has lost his mind. It's a conspiracy theory. That's not a conspiracy theory. It sounds like one, doesn't it? No, this is actually a true story. True story. And guess what? A journalist discovered it. A journalist who worked at a small newspaper in California, a smaller town in California, was just happening to do his own investigation with some drug dealers in his community that had been locked up. He was doing a story on them. He interviewed a few of those in prison. And one thing led to another, and he found out, because he wanted to get to the root of where is this drug trade coming from, and he found out it was actually being funded. These drug dealers, major drug dealers in the inner cities of our country, were being funded. The drugs were coming from, and they were being sold to these major drug dealers by the CIA. The CIA. This is what this reporter discovered. So he goes to Washington, starts inquiring, talking to folks in Congress, certain senators and representatives about this, and he was told, this is a true story again. Journalist was told, you are in way over your head. You need to drop the story, and for your own safety. This is what he was told by government officials, and he did not. As a journalist, he was a courageous journalist. He decided he was going to press forward with the story, and he did. And he published the story. And he initially got a lot of praise and credit for publishing his story. He won a few journalistic awards. But then there was a decision, The media did not run with it by and large, It did start to make some headway, but the power brokers in the media were told to not publish his story. And not only that, there was a campaign from the top down of the CIA to discredit him, and he ended up losing his job. So they dug up dirt in his personal life. Led to his character being tarnished. He ends up losing his job, and then he became unemployable. this man, this journalist, became unemployable with other media outlets. They wouldn't hire him. He couldn't get a job. So he decided to create this was when blogging was beginning. This led up into the early 90s. He started blogging and sharing what he had discovered, and went into the African-American community and shared what he had discovered with black leaders. They were outraged. And all the while, the government denied this man's story. Denied it. Completely denied it. The CIA denied it. Then eventually, this man was found dead. This reporter was found dead in a hotel room with the suicide note, and he claimed that he had committed suicide. Okay? Now, that sounds like conspiracy theory, right? True story. It's actually a movie made about it. The truth, all of this happened. And then in the mid to late 90s, something amazing happened. The director of the CIA, the later director of the CIA, not the one that was denying it at the time, but the story was trying to come out, because of the Freedom of Information Act, okay, that had been passed, government agencies had to release documents when they were pressed on it. The current CIA director at that time, in the late 90s, acknowledged that the CIA introduced crack cocaine to the inner cities of our country, which, in an effort to fund these rebel groups in South America that the U.S. government wanted to fund. This was a way to raise money to fund weapons and, funding for these rebel groups who were more closely aligned to the American government. And they did that. They introduced crack cocaine specifically to raise money for these groups, thereby pretty much causing an entire generation of African Americans to be riddled with addiction to this drug. Kids lost their parents. Fathers went to prisons, mothers were in prisons, mothers were absent, fathers weren't, all of these things. And an entire generation was traumatized. I used to work in a prison. I was a prison guard. I totally get it. It's very commonplace for young black men specifically to be involved in the drug business. All of this was started. You got it from our government. And did you hear about this on the media? No. Even when the CIA, and I'm sharing this for a reason, Black Lives Mattered then, but you didn't hear about it on the news. The CIA, when they acknowledged it, this is not a conspiracy theory, this is actually a news story. When the CIA, the head, acknowledged this program, there were crickets in the media. Can you imagine the outrage? And you think the outrage is bad now because of one man who was killed, as horrible as that is. An entire generation of African Americans were decimated by the drug war. And this was created and introduced into African American communities to prey on their vulnerabilities, their economic vulnerabilities, because it was a highly addicted substance thing. And this was an attempt also. You talk about systematically oppressing a specific group of people. Yes, that happened. It was at the hands of our government. I'm not trying to scapegoat the government, but this is a true story. And the media didn't tell you about it. And instead, what they told you about was Monica Lewinsky, because at the time that this came out, when the CIA acknowledged this program, it was at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. If you remember, she was the lady who had an affair with then President Bill Clinton. Okay, this is what the media was focused on at the time. So when the CIA director acknowledged this, it was not even covered, to the point now where if you're listening to this podcast, you probably think I'm crazy because you've never heard the story, but it's true. Black lives have mattered for a long time. Do not think the media has suddenly seen the light and are just now getting with the program and now sharing the story. No, they're telling you the story to exploit a real issue for the purposes of creating rage. Just like a narcissist would bring up an issue amongst two people to create a fight between those two people, because that's the agenda here. Because if you're hearing about it on the news, it's because they want you to hear about it. Because you still haven't heard about all the other abuses that have went on, that go on all the time. Here's another example of this. Why don't you hear about the new CDC estimates that the coronavirus is vastly less lethal and more, it has a very low mortality rate compared to what they were saying it does. Why don't you hear about that? Because it doesn't go along with the group narrative. Okay. Why are the same politicians? And again, I'm not a supporter of any politician. I'm not a supporter of our president. I don't support him. I don't support the other guy who's running in the election. I'm not a supporter of these folks at all. But this is legitimate. Here's some questions we need to be asking. Okay. Why is the narrative suddenly changing? 2 or 3 weeks ago, the media was, all they would talk about is the lethality of the coronavirus and how dangerous it is, how you can't leave your house because you could die and you could spread and create a second wave of this, and how everybody should stay home. People were trying to go to the beaches here in California, and the governor was very forceful, coming out and closing the beaches and sending police officers down to keep people from going on the beaches. There were a few people protesting in other states because they were angry about the lockdowns and the economy remaining shut. And a lot of politicians were saying, this is very selfish. You heard on the media how many people, you heard these news stories, the selfish protesters who were protesting the opening of the economy. They just want to sacrifice people's lives so they can just earn some money, and people shouldn't be out protesting. And look at all the people that were protesting. They weren't even wearing masks. And this is what we heard just a few weeks ago. And celebrities, politicians were saying, they were all over the airwaves saying, please stay home, wear the mask. If you do go out, social distance, don't come out of your house. These were coming from governors and politicians and celebrities. And the media was saying that. And then all of a sudden, they just dropped that narrative. Like, where's the coronavirus now? Where are the same politicians now that are saying, there's people out in the streets everywhere? Do you hear these politicians begging people to stay home? Please go back in your homes? No. They just completely dropped the narrative. The media is not talking about it at all. By and large, the coronavirus, what's that? When just a few weeks ago, the entire, our entire country, the life of millions of people were on the line. Suddenly, it's just gone. This is how it works in the media. They tell you a story until they're done with it. They expose it. They create terror. And then when the aim is accomplished, they move to the next story. And if you think that you can have we need, and I'm saying this very purposely, we need to have substantive conversations in this country about racism. I agree. We have a systemic issue. We have had systemic issues of racism for a long time. Yes, there have been improvements over the years, and we still have a long way to go. But you cannot have substantive conversations when a narcissist creates the conflict. You cannot have these conversations in the backdrop of terror. We have to cut the puppet strings, like I said in my last episode. You got to recognize the puppet strings of fear and then rage, fight and then flight. We have to have an ability to do that. And you can't just subscribe to groupthink. If you subscribe to groupthink, you can't ask questions. Can I just share this with you? It doesn't matter what other people think. It just simply doesn't matter what other people think. Stop caring what other people think. If I cared what people thought, I wouldn't make this podcast. I certainly wouldn't be doing this episode, because this is not popular. Okay, this doesn't follow the status quo. This is not popular. So it doesn't matter what other people think. Let me encourage all of us. This is my prayer for all of us. This is my encouragement for all of us. We must raise our frequency now. We must raise our frequency. Fear, which is what the media's narrative is, specifically about the coronavirus, lowers your frequency. It actually destroys your immune system. It causes you to not be able to make important decisions. We have a lot of decisions to make about our future, about the kind of world we want to create, and you can't make it when you're afraid. Fear and then rage, anger. These are all things. When you operate in rage and fear, these are low frequency fight or flight responses that keep you powerless. And then you are more susceptible to whatever the solution that gets promoted by the media narratives. You'll be more susceptible to that solution, whatever that is, because you're in such an unempowered state, such a weakened state. We need to raise our frequency. Seriously, it's in 2020 can be one of the greatest years for our evolution. And I believe that is the aim. There is a divine agenda, a divine aim here. Okay. And again, I don't even say that to say resist. No, like the whole idea of stay home, work from home. I believe there's a divine message in that. That means you need to go home and work from home. And I don't mean that physically. I mean, that is a metaphor for coming home internally, dealing with our trauma, healing from our trauma internally, so that we can do our work in the world moving forward. Okay. But we can't do that if we're taken for a ride by the media. The media is taking people for a ride. All folks that are following this narrative, if stop parroting their message. I would love it if we could just look on social media and see people sharing things that are things they want to share, the things that they're passionate about, things that are things from love, things from about being fear and rage are not sustainable. So stop parroting the media's narratives of fear and rage. It's not sustainable. And I just want to share that with you to say, guys, we need to unplug from the media. Okay. It's not helpful. And if you want to have conversations about racism, systemic racism, if you want to have conversations about health, you got to unplug from the media narratives to do it. Let's not have those these are too important of conversations to have in the backdrop of terror created by the mass media. Okay. We need to turn it off. And we need to plug into our internal source so we can be guided, so we can have intuition on this. And the people who are exploiting this tragedy, and there are many folks exploiting this tragedy. We need to start asking those questions. Who's doing that? Who's exploiting this? A lot of folks doing it. Who's doing it? Even the people that we see on social media. If you see people lashing out on social media, my advice would be stop following them. Stop listening to them. They're not accomplishing anything. They're operating out of either fear or rage. Tune out from those folks. Tune into yourself, to your being. Come to the place of peace and rest, and we can move through this. I'm just going to tell you, there's 5 months till an election. It's not going to go away. Okay? It's not going to go away. So if you're tired of being taken on this roller coaster ride from one crisis to the next crisis to the next crisis, they're going to create more crises. Trust me. We have to be people who remain grounded and calm, not in fear or rage. Okay? Buckle in, settle in, come home, breathe, and unplug from the media. All right? All right, until next time, guys. Take care.